generalism that was particularly strong among professors of classics, English, art history, and some philosophical idealists and college presidents. So they were the defenders of the humanist and the generalist model. Matthew Arnold probably being the one that would be most widely known to this audience. It's quite striking that as disciplinarity became an entrenched system of organizing intellectual life and the social and political structure of the academy, a new area of the curriculum in the United States became the home of the ideals of Bildung, general education, and the core curriculum movement, which was also evident in K through 12 in the opening decades of the 20th century. I've referenced a couple of benchmark dates. If you're interested, we could talk a little bit more about particular models they put forward, but the 1919 Columbia's core course on contemporary civilization, which still exists today. It has, talk about a curriculum that has legs. In the 1930s, Chicago in 1945, through the years, perpetually, continuously, maybe perpetually, we'll see. And to today, integrative cores are being formed to try to capture all those ideas, a place to educate the whole person, a place where a more comprehensive rather than specialized technical vocational education could take place. So from the very beginning and still today, there's a tension between whether or not those core curricula ought to be focused on contemporary problems, in particular Columbia was a historical spine, or they ought to focus on the model of Chicago, great texts, great books, books seen as the container of civilization. So that tension has always been there. There is, in addition, a very important shift that occurred in education circles. I've got the dates there, 1935 and 1948, when the National Education Association and a number of influential conferences, workshops, seminars on integration of knowledge argued that unity is no longer possible, that unifying and unified approaches are what we should be aiming for. That's the only thing possible. And you look at 1948 there too, a shift from thinking that it lies within content to believing that it lies within a process, an interplay of an individual. These ideas are very much part of how we think today about education and how we think about the place where a lot of those ideas of building survive in the U.S. Academy, general liberal education. And it's interesting, you look the 1980s forward, I wanted to show you two models to wrap up. The 1980s forward, the trend lines in general education. Certainly cultivating the whole person remains part of the discourse of general and liberal education, but framed by contemporary complexity and diversity. Certainly personal enlightenment in the sense of building the maturation. Certainly a broad exposure to many fields of knowledge. Today we call that multidisciplinary, a term that actually didn't come into wide use until about 1972, based on a typology that emerged in 1970. But we also see in interdisciplinary models of core and multi-year integrated curricula that have been moving from just a single experience to a tiered experience through. And the kind of undergraduate experience that Dean Thomas had is very reflective of that kind of core curriculum, the very solid, this is why you have those values so much at your core. That's one of the purposes, strong purposes of that education, and that kind of an education and a very strong connection to the legacy of Bildung. We also see, I've listed a number of skills that are being prioritized today, and what's quite striking too, when you go about a little more halfway past that list under the 1980s, innovative pedagogies and innovative learning models. There has been a shift from thinking of the educational experience as a teaching model to a learning model, and a great deal of attention being paid in reform, curricular reform now, and making learning the seat, and learning in a much more holistic and integrated fashion. I've mentioned the integrative learning movement, which the Association of American Colleges and Universities has been very strongly promoting in the references I've given you. Their URL, if you'd like to check that out. You can see too in those final 3 bullet points that there have been a number of shifts away from the older notions of unity and universality to thinking more in terms of coherence and relationality. Civilization and world culture used to dominate those early cores, those whole person cores. Now far more global, international, comparative perspective. And the notion that knowledge is shifted, major shift in the metaphor of knowledge, that it's not a foundation or a structure, but a dynamic system, a network. Just to close, I wanted to share with you one good benchmark of the other side there, just above the record. LEAP, the Liberal Education in America's Promise campaign of the Association of American Colleges and Universities, is a very good index of what we're thinking today ought to be in an undergraduate experience. What should an educated person have? And what's quite striking about this is you can see both tradition and contemporary concerns. That is, knowledge of human cultures, certainly that broad multidisciplinary base, and even the old notion of the res magna, the big ideas, the important questions and problems. We have seen, though, when you look under intellectual and practical skills, an increased attention to information literacy and teamwork and problem solving. The danger, though, is an anti-Bildung reduction to instrumental and vocational needs, and that is an ever-present danger, an ever-present part of the discourse. We also see the persistence of the civic ideal, personal and social responsibility, what we think people ought to be able to do as citizens, workers, learners, parents. And then finally, a notion that people ought to have an integrative capacity. So it's been quite fascinating to watch this history, watch this discourse. And Roz and I practically drove off the road today. When I was tallying up the years, I was thinking, we've invested much of our lives in integrative approaches to general and liberal education. I thought, oh geez, that's more than 35 years for each of us. That would make 70 years of experience. So on that lofty note, let me end it. I'm not sure if you want to discuss it or if we'd like to move on.
5 minutes for this.
Okay. Roz, you want to join me?
Sure.
Congratulations on our 70 years. Anybody like to make a comment? Yeah.
I'm wondering, is this, thinking about the contemporary trends, I'm wondering about the increase in education that's being taken up by the community colleges as well as the for-profit universities, and I'm wondering if you see the same Bildung ideals in those institutions as well, because that seems to be the contemporary trend, is that more education is going in that direction. So
that creates a greater marginalization of the prospect of Bildung. It's quite interesting to see that when it does occur there, that interdisciplinary core integrative reforms have taken place in particularly the community college sector. The problem is, though, it's so small in a student's overall percentage, and it actually happens to be one of the places that humanities survives, because humanities will often be given that function. So it is reductivity. It's even more likely to have marginalization in vocational and quite a number of online academies that try to do training, maximize that. Roz is referencing instrumentalism, vocationalism over that more holistic model. So it is good to see in that reform sector some resonance for the idea, but it is increasingly marginalized. And we also have to ask a much larger question: why are liberal arts marginalized within the culture as well? So it's part of a dual process here. Marcia.
This is more a comment than it is a question. I just, excuse me, wanted to include science in the mix a little bit, because the conception of Bildung in science integrated in Germany in the early reform movement that the von Humboldt brothers were involved in, and was transferred to the United States, particularly at the founding of the Johns Hopkins University. And I think that that's very interesting in the sense that teaching and research in the sciences became integrated from early on. Unfortunately, I think by virtue of the specialization in the sciences, the scientific education has gotten away a little bit from including the complete Bildung within the education, and that might be something to include in the discussion.
That's such an important remark. Thank you for it. Historically as well, because there have been a lot of discussions about what happened at Johns Hopkins Germans when the Americans who went to Germany to study the German research model came back. And their tendency to put more emphasis on research than on learning as part of a much larger cultural model. You also remind us that the legacy of science being part of a whole educated experience was very strong in the work of Matthew Arnold. Matthew Arnold's ideas were circulated widely in the New World, and he was very influential. Matthew Arnold argued that the social and moral purpose of education ought to include training in not just literature, poetry, but also Greek science, and then the writings of Darwin, Copernicus, contemporary scientists. So thank you for bringing that.
I just wanted to make one comment. As all of you know, I was a faculty member for many years in the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies, most recently the ISP, and now a faculty member in German in classical and modern languages, literatures, and cultures. And one of the things that I've noticed through the years, just in terms of the development of this, and for me it's been interesting to work with Julie on this too, because of my background in interdisciplinary studies and the clear affinity here between interdisciplinary studies and the concept of Bildung in all of its complexities. But we all know as teachers of foreign language, those of us who came up during the years when it was, for example, Germanic languages and literatures, as my PhD is from the University of Pennsylvania, and now we have a much greater number of studies programs that acknowledge all of the different disciplines, including science, of course, in educating graduate students or even undergraduate students. And that's important to me also, and I'm seeing it more and more, of course, in our own German area of our department.
Some of these ideas come from a time and from places where universal literacy or access to the liberal arts education wasn't seen as a universal right, perhaps. Could you talk about the stresses between our focus on universal access and universal literacy and some of these ideas that might have come out of a more elitist or hierarchical society?
Well, I'm glad that you called attention to that split, because as I mentioned, the American Colonial College, when these ideas came in as a cultural inheritance, if you will, they were very much for an elite body. So one of the important historical shifts that's taken place, and that makes this not a paradigm regain, but a paradigm remake, are taking a look at the demographic shifts in the student body, taking a look at, as Michael was also raising, taking a look at the expanding diversity of institutions do not serve simply. So it's I think what's interesting is when you take a look at the LEAP statement, the LEAP is a model intended to be for all institutions, to talk about what all educated students ought to be familiar with, capable of doing, etc. So it is an attempt to democratize that, although you bring us back to thinking about the original purpose of antiquity of the paideia and the whole model, the whole person model. It was to cultivate somebody who had that kind of threat, but a smaller population.
I'm sorry, I have to cut this short. I've given very strict instructions.